Good afternoon, and welcome to my New Thought community talk on Jesus, Jim Morrison, and the resurrection. Before we get started, I'd like to give a disclaimer that I've adapted from Mark Vonnegut's book, The Eden Express. I maintain that all people, places, and events in this talk are real and that I have depicted them accurately and to the best of my ability. Before drawing conclusions, however, the audience is cautioned to bear in mind that I have spent a considerable amount of time mentally unbalanced and perhaps spiritually unbalanced. You know, my favorite Catholic holiday is Easter. And for those who don't know, Easter is the day we celebrate Jesus rising from the dead and coming back to the earth as a rabbit to hide colored Easter eggs. Sounds absurd. We'll find out. The inspiration for this talk comes from a good friend of mine, Mark Hoppy, who I knew growing up in grade school and high school. And when we were about 19 or 20, we hadn't seen each other in some time. And when he approached me, he had seen me from a distance. And he came up to me and he said, "Hey man, when I saw you get out of your car, I didn't know if you were Jesus or Jim Morrison." So thank you, Mark Hoppy, for this inspiration. I really loved Reverend Kathy Landis's talk on rolling away the stone, and I hope this talk somehow segues into that and connects some of those representations. I would like to start off appropriately with something I picked up from Ernest Holmes, and this was from the Science of Mind, the complete edition, which I have here, a copy of. And so I'd like to read it and hopefully set the tone for the next 15 or so minutes. So this is Lesson 6, Psychic Phenomenon and Immortality. The resurrection body then will not have to be snatched from some cosmic shelf as the soul soars aloft, but will be found to exist already within. Everything is from within, for life is from within. The resurrection body of Jesus shone so that it could not be looked upon, because it was more spiritual one than the physical eye is used to beholding. In the words of our dear friend Don Oscar, we are immortal in being. Madhu Anziani, in one of his songs from his CD from last year, Songs from the Rose Garden, talks about, "I am beyond form, fearlessly free to be me." So growing up Catholic, as I did, going through schools and church and so forth, Holy Week was one of those times where I actually really did enjoy going to church. And it was something for me to behold, and I just, for whatever reason, I was an altar boy, and I always volunteered to serve Holy Thursday in particular, but I always would volunteer to serve as many masses as I could. And so we used to call, at least when I was young, there was a lot of different names, but the Feast of Thomas. I don't know if that's what it's called or not, but that's how I remember it. And so I always remember the Apostle Thomas, or one of Jesus's followers, and I always remember sort of connecting with this doubting Thomas. But yet at that time when I was young, I really could see the literal ideas of the resurrection and Jesus coming back from the dead and all the things that I was taught. So I really did kind of embrace that type of literal interpretation. I'm always struck by one of the lines from the Book of Thomas where Jesus is said to say, "He who is close to me is close to the fire." I was always struck by what I saw on Holy Thursday especially, and the bishop or the priest would be washing the feet as a symbolic representation of Jesus washing the feet of the apostles. So the Holy Week, the resurrection, Good Friday, just had a lot of meaning to me. But as such, I grew up began to have my own mind and began to have my own thoughts. And one of the connections in this talk and why I'm bringing up Jim Morrison is there's a song by the Doors called "When the Music's Over." It's a great song, but one of the lines in the song, Morrison sings, "Cancel my subscription to the resurrection." And I remember listening to those words and thinking about the meaning of that, and really rejecting entirely the thoughts of resurrection, whether it was symbolic or anything. I just thought that this was something that was not, a part of my life, and I just blocked out everything associated with some of the good things that I actually did learn growing up in the Catholic religion. In my life, I've experienced resurrection, and in 12-step recovery, and even in religions, they talk about being born again or reborn. And in AA, I learned about the concept of being reborn, not in the sense of anything religious, but just in the sense of being reborn to a new life, a life that's free from addiction, free from obsessions, free from self-centeredness and the like. So at the age of 22, I was faced with looking at some of my old ideas and where they were failed, and where they didn't serve me anymore. And one of the things I really connected with in 12-step recovery was the St. Francis prayer. Now, that St. Francis prayer, I'm sure most of you know, and maybe knew. I didn't know of the St. Francis prayer, even though I grew up Catholic. I didn't know of the St. Francis prayer until I came to AA and came into the 12 steps. And what I found interesting, one of the lines, I love the whole prayer, but one of the lines in the prayer is, "It is by dying that one awakens to eternal life." And I was taught that dying meant dying to self. And dying to self, for me, means dying to some of my character defects, some of my behaviors, the things that drove me to act in ways that I didn't want to act. So that idea, that symbolic death and this symbolic resurrection really did begin to have a meaning for me. And what it meant, as I said before, was sort of an awakening to a happy and joyful life, free from the bondage of addiction, self-centeredness, and like Madhu says, fearlessly free to be me. And that's been the resurrection for me, and I know for many of you as well. Early on, when I went back to school, I was lucky enough that I was a history major. I studied biology as well, but I was a history major, and I got to read a lot, and I got to study history, and I got to take a lot of humanities courses, and I got to read a lot about rebirth and recycling, and particularly the chthonic cults. And the chthonic cults tended to be more of a feminine natured cult, and again, cult being sort of an organization, but a belief system, not necessarily something that's bad or anything. But if you look at the word chthonic, it's a Greek word, or it's derived from a Greek word, and it means subterranean or earth. And when I think of earth, I think of something real, and I think of something solid to hold on to. And by that by that tone, I think of the chthonic cults as sort of this rebirth, recycling, the way nature is during the seasons.